You are, so let's start with who you are. And today is April the 11th, I think, or 12th. Do you know what day today is?
Is it 12th, Mom?
Excuse me?
What date is it?
Today? Today is,
Might be the 12th. Might be the,
today is Saturday. Wednesday was the 9th, Thursday 10th. Friday 11th, 12th, that's right.
okay, today's the 12th of April, 2008.
Okay.
We got that decided. Who are you?
Well, I'm C.W. Allerheiligen, Marysville, and when I graduated from high school, I decided to learn a trade, and I went to work for a store in Marysville and learned how to cut meat. And back then, your meat coolers were also a place to display milk and butter and margarine and so forth. And so every time the window doors would be open, it'd be warm air going into the cooler. And of course, when we opened the big door to get our meat out, front quarter or hind quarter, it also would let heat in. And then also in the meat cooler, you would find lettuce and all the produce, because there was no other place to keep it cool until it was available for sale. And you'd find lettuce and watermelon and everything else in the cooler. But the meat stayed in good shape, and you had to cut it up and display it in a meat case. There wasn't any wrapping at that time. You did everything by scale, and you would also have like sauerkraut come in a barrel, and you'd let the people or the gals know that came in and wanted to buy something for the evening meal. That you had sauerkraut and big dill pickles, and you could buy a real large dill pickle for a nickel, and sauerkraut for 8 or 9 cents a pound. You would put the sauerkraut in a hamburger tray, and that's how they would sell sauerkraut at that time. They also had it in a can, but fresh sauerkraut always sounded good to people. So then we would take a front quarter out of the cooler and cut it down into chuck roast and round roast, and then you'd come to standing rib, which was 7 ribs from the end of the front quarter. And nobody seemed to want that part of the beef in the early 40s, and it was hard to get rid of. But now, that's the first thing they want is ribeyes, and so everybody wants the front quarter of the rib out of the front quarter. Then the hind quarter, of course, you have round steak and sirloin steak and T-bones, and then a couple shortcuts, and called Kansas City. We call them Kansas City steaks, and most restaurants call them New York steaks. And but anyway, you had to learn how to cut all that stuff and where it came from. And at one time, I don't know if I could do it today because I'm an old man, but at one time I could take a piece of meat, maybe 2 inches tall, and maybe a 2-pound piece of meat. And I could tell you exactly where it came from the animal, because I had been able to bone that much for hamburger. We boned all our hamburger meat back then because beef wasn't, you had plenty of suet and fat on your beef, but it was all usable, or nearly all usable. And today, everybody wants a better flavored piece of meat, so you buy a better grade of meat, and then you take the trimmings off of it and make hamburgers. So today's hamburger, to my notion, is nothing near the flavor that it was years ago. Years ago, you bought cow meat, a cow that wasn't good for milking anymore and so forth, and you'd bone it out, and it made the best flavored hamburger you could buy. Well, today you don't get that, and the meat was leaner. So, and another maybe interesting point would be around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'd get a whole bunch of ladies coming in and wondering what they were going to have for supper. They didn't have it in a refrigerator at home, so they come and they decide there what they were going to have that night. And it was sort of fun to suggest whatever we were long on, so and how to fix it and so forth. And you'd pretty near sell out. Everybody thought, oh, that'd be good tonight, so they'd fix that for supper. So I started cutting meat, or learning how to cut meat at a grocery store. And
What grocery store was it?
Well, it was a red and white store in Marysville, and in this block, 2 doors down was an A&P store, and then our store was red and white store, home owned, and then 2 doors east of us was a Safeway store, all in the same block.
And what block was that? What's
That
there
was
now?
between the 8th and 9th block on the north side of the street on Broadway in Marysville. And I'll have to say that we were the place to come and buy meat and groceries. He was a very honest merchant, and he just wouldn't allow anything. And it's an awful lot like Roy Sutherland. He was the same way. He just would not think of even selling anybody a 15-ounce piece of meat for £1. It'd have to be 16 ounces, or he would feel very bad, and he just wouldn't let it happen. Well, that's when Roy got sick when he first bought the store, and first time I met him. And 1 or 2 weeks later, he is when he really got sick and he couldn't come to the store. So I went to his house and I told him that I was a meat cutter. Oh, I better tell you that now I'm a meat salesman. And I went to work for Wilson Company. Their age limit back then was 26 to 32, and I just happened to turn 26 on the 4th of March, or the 8th of March, pardon me. And 2 weeks later, I was a salesman. And what really prompted me to become a salesman was the salesman that came in always drove new cars. And I never was able to buy a new car, but then I would have to buy a new car. And it was real interesting there too. I had an arrangement with the Ford company here in Marysville that I would buy a new car, and we would finance it at the bank, and I'd pay the bank $100 a month, regardless of what kind of car I had. So sometimes the Ford dealer would need a car that had a few miles on it, and he'd come and trade with. I'd be playing golf or something, he'd come and trade my car, he'd take mine and leave a new one sit there. And it didn't matter because my payments were $100 a month. And so it was cheap transportation, really. My territory with Wilson Company was around 600 miles a week. So you had to have something that would get you to these other towns to sell meat and get you back home. When I first started selling meat in 1949, I had a 1939 Chevy, and it was a nice little car, but it just wasn't made for that many miles a week, and I had to travel pretty fast to get my work done within the first 2.5, 3 days because we had railroad shipping at first, and I would sell somebody some meat, and it would come in on a rail, and it was on a warm rail. It was a refrigerated car, but by the time they took it in a little pickup truck from the train to the store, it just didn't have the right odor anymore, and so the railroad would take it back, and then I'd go down, I'd sell it 1 week and go down to the railroad and write claims for what what meat came in. And then all of a sudden here we start having truck service, and the store down in Blue Rapids was just had started about that time too, because we didn't have to send it by rail anymore, and the meat came in nice and fresh with the company's own trucks. Something also that happened, I took this job of selling meat with Wilson Company, and there was no territory here, and so the sales district sales manager rode with me a half a day on Monday and showed me how to open up my book, write the invoice, and what the people needed. And this wasn't too hard because a new salesman with a new company coming in, you didn't write very many orders. Mm-hmm. And but the company had told me that you go into every place that needs meat, and you go into these places at least 10 times. So sometimes you would go to a store 10 times, and they would say they didn't need anything, and then all at once they would start buying from you. And it wasn't probably, well, then my car, I'm kind of telling my personal stuff.
Good.
My car was good enough for me if I would stay in the meat cutting business, but meat selling business, I had to have a better car. And this is another little off interest of being in the meat business, but I had a fellow on the route that I told him that I'm going to have to get a newer car because my '39 Chevy just wouldn't make it back home a lot of times. And he said, he says, boy, what a break. He said, I bought a new car 2 years ago. I've been paying on it, and now I can't pay on it anymore, and I'm going to lose my car. Why don't you let me have your car, and you take mine and finish payments on it? And it appealed to me because I needed a different car, and his was pretty near new. And so that was my new car then, and it was a '46 Ford in 1949, and it didn't have any miles on it. So, and so that worked out fine. And then found out that credit at the grocery stores a lot of times, it was hard for them to pay for the invoice that came with the meat shipment, and our terms were 7 days because before you sold another order, you were supposed to collect for the last order. And sometimes this is hard to do for some of the stores. Well, if they didn't pay you, then it would be put on COD, and that was worse. And I did have one account in one of these little towns that he had a good business, and this is not in Blue Rapids, it was in Seneca. And Armour and Swift had put this man on a COD, and I kept him open. And the reason I kept him open, every time I would come in, I would say, well, Bill, let's go to coffee. And we went to coffee, and I told Bill, one thing about you, Bill, when I sell you an order of meat, and I say, well, now you owe $760 or something, you would pay me. And it's such a joy. I never have any trouble with you. You just pay like you have favorite towns, and any salesman that sold meat or cigarettes or whatever would have favorite towns because you could go into a town and they would buy pretty near everything you had, and then you go into a town and maybe you'd go back out of the town and not sell anything. And one of my favorite towns was Blue Rapids, and this fellow's name was Roy Sutherland that owned it, or just bought it and owned it, and we got acquainted real good, and Roy and I became friends, and he kind of took care of me because I was a guy that was trying to sell the meat, and I took care of him the best I could when he needed help. And he did get sick right after he bought the store, and the second week I went to his house and told him that I was a meat cutter and I would keep his case full for him if he wanted me to. And he says, "Oh, that's a load off my mind." He says, "I'd like to be down there to do this, but I can't." And I said, "Well, I'll take care of it for you. And I might even have to tell myself what you need for the next week." And he said, "Well, that's fine." And that almost carried through all the time that Roy was in business. I hardly had to ask him at all what he would want the shipment to be. And I would write my own order and definitely not overload him or just so I had enough. And then I did continue to cut meat for him on Fridays. It was a day off for me. And I'd get everything ready for his case. So when his big day was always Saturdays, and it was a big day for everybody on Saturdays for the farmers and so forth to come to town. Now today on Saturdays, hardly see anybody in town. But back then you did, and they'd go to the show and first they'd buy their groceries and leave it sit in the store until they got through going to a movie or did something else, and made it real late for the grocerymen, but they went along with it, and that was business. But anyway, then here Roy decided he had to get himself a meat cutter. So he got a hold of a young man called Gail Poulsen, and of course this kid didn't know anything about cutting meat, so I said, "Well, I'll teach him if you want me to." And so I stayed with him